it seems. It was quite exciting last night. Very bombastic thundering I hadn't heard in some time. We are getting back to our study of the life of Abraham. I was compelled by circumstances beyond my control to take a reprieve for a couple weeks, which is why Buddy was filling in, doing a study of Jude real quickly. But we're going back to Genesis chapter 19. I do want to do a little bit of review because it's been a few weeks since we've been in this study. You'll recall Genesis chapter 18, Abraham was visited by three men, I guess, is the form they take, but certainly it's understood that these are probably angels of God. That seems to be confirmed in Genesis 19 later on. And they basically, there's several things that are mentioned. The fact that Sarah is going to bear him a son, and he's going to have Isaac. That's going to be a thing that's going to be coming up, which kind of lets us know that a lot of these chapters are all taking place in a very short amount of time, because there's only so much time that goes in between him being told, hey, this time next year, you're going to have a son by Sarah, and then a few chapters later, that's going to happen. So all these chapters around this time period take place in the same year. And one more thing God tells him before his presence departs Abraham, if you will, is he tells him, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham kind of goes back and forth. He's like, for 50 people, would you spare it? For 40, would you spare it? Gets him down to 10. For 10 righteous people, would you spare the city? And God says, yes. Now, the implication is that there were not 10 righteous people in that city because that city was destroyed. In fact, we're going to talk about probably more of this as we conclude chapter 19. But we got into chapter 19 a couple weeks ago, the first half, where it says two angels of the Lord. It seems to imply two of the angels that had been with Abraham the previous chapter. It doesn't say that outright, but I think that's a pretty good assumption. They come into Sodom, and Lot meets them, and he kind of really begs them not to spend the night in the square. He says, please come to my place. Please come to my place. I'll provide for you. He does, and while they're there at Lot's house, men of the city, all men of the city from Sodom, young and old, it gives a very wide description that it's not just one group of, gangsters or bad guys in the city. It's people from the entire city, the whole stretch, have come over to Lot's house, and they're trying to bang on the door and say, hey, bring these guys out to us that we can have our way with them. And Lot says, don't do this. This is a wicked thing. And Lot is trying to be a protective host here, but what's he going to do? In fact, they start trying to break down the door, and the angels inflict the men in the city with blindness, and they tell Lot, okay, you need to get out of here. We are destroying the city. If there's anyone with you, take them with you out of the city. So Lot, of his household, he has himself, his wife, his two daughters, and he has what seems to be two men of the city who are betrothed to his daughter. So he goes to them, warns them, God's going to destroy the city. We got to get out of here. And it seems they think he is joking or just messing with them. Whatever the case, they don't believe him. So he leaves them behind. In fact, he kind of hesitates, and the angels have to lead him and his family out of the city. And they tell him, go to the mountains, flee for your lives. And does Lot say, okay, I'm getting out of here? No, he says, wait, hold on. I got one more thing. If I flee to the mountains, I'm going to die. I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to survive that. So he says, let me flee to this little city over here. It's a little small city. It's not that big. It's not much. Can I please flee to that? And that request is granted. Now, the city he goes to is called Zoar after that point. It's been referenced a couple times. Its earlier name was Bela. This is one of the 5 cities that were part of the 5-king coalition that included Sodom and Gomorrah, Zeboim, and Admah. Now, what we're going to find out is those other 4 are all destroyed, and this one is spared. And we're going to talk about that, I guess, a little bit more. I've mentioned it several times, maybe why that was. And he goes there, and well, let's just pick up right there. That's about where we stopped. Anything before we haven't gotten into Lot's wife turning into pillar of salt yet, so don't get ahead of me on that. Anything else before we move on through the rest of chapter 19? I plan to finish it today. This is a pretty good review, yeah? We're all up to speed here? Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and we'll continue chapter 19. Someone read for us. Let's see. We'll start in verse 23. We read that one last week, but it works better. Read verse 23 through, where do I want to go? Verse 23 through 26.
By the time Lot reached Zoar, the sun had risen over the land, and the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities, and also the vegetation in the land. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt.
Okay. So, Lot gets to his destination. He gets to Zoar, which would have been called Bela before this, but if I refer to it as Zoar, Bela, they're the same place. He gets there at sunrise. So this whole event here, this first half of chapter 19, is taking place in one night. It's the encompassing of the whole night. He gets there in verse 23. The sun is rising. At verse 24, we see that now that Lot is safe, God is raining down burning sulfur, or maybe depending on translation, fire and brimstone. They will differentiate a little bit. I'm not sure it really matters. But destructive power, I'll just put it that way, on the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And apparently this is also going to include other cities of the plain. In fact, that's what it says here in these verses, that he destroys the entire plain, all those living in those cities. So we always say Sodom and Gomorrah, that's kind of a catch-all. But remember, if we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 23, it also includes the cities by name of Zeboim and Admah. And I suppose it's possible that there are other ones that were destroyed in that region, but those are the two big ones. So when we say the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, what we really mean is that region of the world, I think, is probably a better way to look at it. Because if you look at some of this description here, it's not just the cities that are destroyed. It talks about the vegetation of the land that was also destroyed. So this whole area is destroyed, not just pinpoint individual city here and here and here. It's the whole area is destroyed. Now, I think it's interesting that it mentions this vegetation here being destroyed because remember, this was what drew Lot to this area when he and Abraham, or I guess he was Abram back in those times, in Genesis chapter 13, when they decide they're going to go their separate ways, Abram says to Lot, pick which way you want to go and I'll go the opposite way. And Lot looks over the land of the plain where Sodom and Gomorrah are, and he says, this is good land for grazing. I'm going to go this way. So the thing that drew him to that area is now also gone. It's not just the cities, it's everything that was desirable of that land is gone. So that's a really interesting thing. If you want to read back at that, that's Genesis chapter 13, verses 10 and 11, when Lot makes that observation, and that helps him make his choice in a way, if you will. Now, we have this interesting thing at the end of what was read here in verse 26, says that Lot's wife looked back and she became a pillar of salt. Now, they were specifically instructed by the angels of God not to look back at the destruction. You see that in verse 17 of this chapter. So when we wonder about, well, why did this happen? What was the reason for this punishment? It could be simply it was lack of obedience. She disobeyed the order. Or maybe it was that she had a remaining desire for the land of Sodom or the city of Sodom, regrets of leaving it behind. We don't really know for sure. I don't want to get into too much speculation because this is kind of the most we ever see of Lot's wife is just this one little sentence. And we draw a lot of conclusions from that. Maybe we can draw a few more later on. I'll get back to that. But we don't really know for sure what her rationale was and why this was the reason, or the way, rather, that God decided to punish her for this. But it is a very unique punishment. We don't see this kind of thing happen anywhere else. Now, before I move on from these verses, there's one thing about Lot's wife I do want to discuss that some of you might find interesting if you like geography and archaeology, is that perhaps Lot's wife is still there today. Now, I don't necessarily just subscribe to this, but it's an interesting thing, so I'm going to share it. If you look at I don't have my map up here. I should have brought that with me. On kind of the southern, maybe partly western part of the Dead Sea, there's this literal pillar of salt. It's not all salt 100%, but it's got salt mixed into it. That is referred to as Lot's wife. The locals there call it Lot's wife. It's about 60 feet high, or 65 feet high rather, in the area of Mount Sedom, which sounds very similar to Sodom. And like I said, the locals, they call it Lot's wife. The structure is extremely odd. There are some geographical explanations about how it got there. It's just kind of randomly out there. You can look it up online. There's some pictures. You're going to see actually different things that people will refer to Lot's wife, and they kind of look different from different angles. And some people say, well, no, it's not that pillar. It's that pillar over there that's next to it, and all this. So I was not going to like try to get a picture of it because I'm like, well, I might get the wrong one because I don't know. I'm not from there. But you might want to look into that. It's kind of an interesting thing. I don't think that's actually probably Lot's wife, because I would think probably the salt would have dissolved and eroded over time, but I could be wrong. But the locals there obviously know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they still refer to this pillar that is made of at least partly salt as Lot's wife, which could be kind of a joke in a way, but you might find that interesting. Go ahead and look it up if you're interested. I just thought I'd mention it. I don't really have much more to say. Just kind of an interesting thing if you're into archaeology and geography. Any other thoughts up through verse 26? Go ahead, Jeff.
You know, when they were hurrying Lot and his family out of the city, they grabbed their hands. Basically, you get the idea they pulled them out of the city.
Yeah.
They're reluctant to go, and they tell them not to look back. That seemed like a minor detail. That's the kind of thing that we might overlook in the hurry to get out of town and the angels pulling you and everything. But it teaches us that we need to train ourselves to notice every detail when God gives us his commands. Because we want to be faithful, we want to be accurate, we want to understand him, and we want to please him. And so it's just something for us to keep in mind, to train ourselves to pay attention to the details God gives. There's probably not any, I think you could say that God generally doesn't use extraneous information. He gives us, everything he gives us is important. Mm-hmm. I know that there are some things more important than others, but pay attention to the details. Don't overlook anything.
And you could even say there's a practical reason not to turn back. I don't know if any of you have run or seen runners who are in a competition, and when they're running down the home stretch, they're not looking around, seeing who's around me, am I in front? They have to keep forward, because the moment you turn around and you look, well, you're slowing down, you might be veering off course a little bit, you get out of your lane. You have to be very well trained to keep going, because that's the fastest way to go, is keep looking ahead. So you could even say if she's turning back, she's not really trying to get out of there as fast as she can. There's a whole lot of things that we can pull out of this. I think the most important thing is that she did not follow the instructions. She was punished for that. And this is despite all the mercy they've been shown up to this point. Lot, we give Lot a big hard time about a lot of things, and he hesitates. He's not sure what to do. He's having a really hard time here, and the angels literally take him, as Jeff was saying, take them by the hand, get them out of the city. But at least he seems to not look back. He keeps going. He finally gets it, and he's like, okay, I'm not going to turn back. His daughters don't turn back, to their credit. Of course, they're going to have an issue later. But for whatever, Lot's wife was not able to do that. So I don't want to pull out too much more than we know. But it just is it's an interesting kid's story that we like to kick around to say, hey, you better listen to what you're told, or else you're going to turn into a pillar of salt. I'm not sure that's going to happen quite that way, but it is certainly a unique punishment here in this case. Anything else before we move on to the next section?
Jesus makes a good point there too, when he says that once you lay your hand to the plow and turn back, you're not worthy of the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah. And in that case, he's really talking about, once you commit yourself to serving God, if you deviate from that in any way, well, you're not serving God in the way you ought to. Yeah, very good point.
And she was still longing for the things in Sodom and Gomorrah, so she's still longing for those things behind.
Yeah, whatever it was that had her attention or her heart or something was keeping her from doing what she needed to do. Absolutely. Let's go ahead and read the next few verses. Someone read 27 through 29.
And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had
Okay, so this is kind of Abraham's only mention here in this chapter. So, we don't get to skip it because he is in this chapter for a brief time. It's the morning, and Abraham goes out and he looks and he sees thick smoke rising from the cities of the plain. Sodom, Gomorrah are mentioned specifically, but of course this would be the other ones like Admah, Zeboim, of course the ones we know that are mentioned in Deuteronomy 29, verse 23. Now, do you guys remember where Abraham is at this time?
He's in the land of Canaan.
He's in the land of Canaan. Does anyone remember specifically where he is? We've been told. This isn't a trick question. He's in the area of Hebron, where the great trees of Mamre are. So he's been mentioned being there several times. That seems to be his main hangout for quite some time during these last several chapters of Genesis. And it says he went to the place where he was with the Lord. So it sounds like he's still in the same place in Hebron. That would be my assumption. Now, we kind of have to guess where Sodom and Gomorrah and these other cities of the plain were because we're not sure exactly because, well, they were wiped out. We haven't really found the remains of them yet, or at least haven't confirmed them. So we're estimating it's somewhere around the southern area of the Dead Sea. We're looking at a distance of probably about 40 plus miles, give or take. That's an estimation. So Abraham is able to look out, and 40 miles away, he's seeing this dense smoke. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever seen like a big fire or volcano eruption or anything. You can see it for a long ways away, but it has to be something that's very intense, like thick, bellowing, black smoke, like the worst kind of smoke. It's not going to be like somebody's little campfire or something like that. This is going to be something that is so huge, people in all the area of Canaan are going to be able to see it if Abraham's able to see it, because he is not completely on the other side of Canaan, but he's not close. He's about 40-ish miles away. So he's able to look out and see this. And kind of some interesting details in these verses I do want to touch on. And this may depend on your translation, but the way my translation puts verse 29, it says, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out from the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived. So it almost sounds like for the sake of Abraham, Lot was spared. Now, I'm not going to get into this too much because I think the answer is probably pretty simple. Was Lot saved because Abraham was so righteous, or was Lot saved because he himself was a righteous man? As 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 6 through 9 talk about Lot being righteous amongst the wickedness of the city of Sodom. And I think it's probably both. I don't think it's just because of Abraham. Lot by proxy is saved because he's his nephew. I think if Lot had succumbed to the wickedness of Sodom, he would not have been spared. I don't see anything in the text that says, maybe aside from possible wording of this verse in this translation, that no, he was only saved because he was the nephew of Abraham. I think it was, yes, there was that connection, but Lot himself was still trying to be a righteous man despite the area he was in. Go ahead, Arnold.
And Lot could be that one righteous person that was, in Sodom and Gomorrah, but his sake he spared.
Yeah, if only there were 9 more of him, maybe the whole city would have been spared. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Yeah, absolutely. It seems from 2 Peter's description of Lot that he was kind of all by himself, trying to be a righteous man in the midst of all this wickedness. So I don't think it's only because he was the nephew of Abraham that for some reason God said, well, I really like Abraham, so I'm going to spare his nephew. I think there was absolutely this relationship that Lot himself was trying to also be a righteous man, even though he definitely had his mistakes, and we're going to see a few more here. He was really trying. Like we look at the beginning of Genesis chapter 19, and he takes these angels. He doesn't know they're angels. They're just men to him. He takes them into his home. He's being a good host. He's trying to protect them from the men of the city, even though he really can't. But he's trying to do the right thing. But, of course, he seems to have other mistakes along the way. I think Abraham was a good influence on him for sure, but I think he was really trying to be everything he could be on his own still. And that's about all there is of Abraham in this chapter. Any other comments before we move on to the last section of this chapter? Go ahead, Jeff.
We sometimes think that when we mess up, it's on us, it's our soul that's involved, but there's a lot of people that depend sound like it's through the mediation of angels. It sounds like it's with God.
Yeah, it's written that way, which makes it complicated. It certainly does.
You know, Jesus, I believe Jesus appeared to Joshua right before the Battle of Jericho, because it says that Joshua worshiped him, and he didn't rebuke like angels would if he tried to worship an angel. So it just makes me wonder if one of these three in chapter 18 may have been Christ, or, you know, in a human form. I'm not sure if that would work. I know that
The way I look at it is it's some conduit between Abraham and the Lord. We don't really know what that is, because when we look at 19, and you look at the end of 18, we see it says the men leave, but the Lord stays. Now there were 3 of them. 2 show up in chapter 19. So it sounds like one stayed behind and talked with Abraham longer in chapter 18, and the 2 others went on to Sodom in chapter 19. But it doesn't say angel of the Lord in verse 18. It says the Lord.
It says men in the 18th chapter.
Yeah, it will describe them as men.
In the 19th chapter.
Yeah.
And they have a conversation between themselves while Abraham is still there. If you read in the text, he says, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do?" So those 3 individuals are having a conversation amongst themselves that Abraham's not included in. And then the Lord tells Abraham what he's about to do.
Yeah, he begins to open up at he has the Lord kind of talks to himself. I don't know if that's the best way of looking at it. Kind of the 16 through 19, and then after that, he kind of verse 22, 23, the 2 leave, and seems the Lord or the one stays behind and talks to Abraham openly. And again, it doesn't word it as angels in verse 18, but then when we get to 19, it calls the 2 that are there angels at the very beginning, in the first verse, I believe. Yeah. So it's the way I look at it is it's probably angels, and one is speaking very directly to Abraham as the Lord, but it doesn't say that. It's different. It is unique. It's not a wording we typically see. So it's one of those things we're not going to fully grasp, perhaps.
the important thing I want to get at and remind us is that our prayers to God and the life we lead, those are the 2 things that Abraham gave to Lot. And we give that to our loved ones. And the way, you know, talking about our kids, our teenagers when they were young and maybe doing things that are a little more dangerous. They get out of our out from home, doing various things. We offer prayers to God. We need to live a life like Abraham, and God will look upon our loved ones favorably, perhaps in some circumstances. If that's our prayers.
Yeah, I think the important thing is that there is a conversation between God and, in this case, the righteous man is Abraham in chapter 18, and God fulfills his promise. He says, yeah, I will be merciful. I will be merciful, even if there's only 10 people in the city. But then we look at chapter 19, the implications that there's not even 10 righteous people in the city. I would even argue probably not even Lot's family. We're going to get into that a bit more once we get to the end here. But yeah, and that's a whole thing. We could debate a lot of these details, but it's not enough for us to say for sure this is how it was. But certainly there was conversation between Abraham and the Lord in some fashion. We just don't know exactly really how it was done, just because the way it's worded, it's a little bit confusing. But that conversation was certainly there. Very good. Let's finish this off. Someone read for us verses 30 through 38, through the end of the chapter, please.
And Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountains, and his 2 daughters with him, for he feared to dwell in Zoar. And he dwelt in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said unto the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. And he knew not when she lay down, nor when she arose. And it came to pass on the morrow, go thou in, and lie with him, that he may preserve seed of, we may preserve seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him, and he knew not when she lay down, nor when she arose. Thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. And the firstborn bare a son, and called his name Moab. The same is the father of the Moabites unto this day. And the younger, she also bare a son, and called his name Ben-Ami. The same is the father of the children of Ammon unto this day.
Okay. So Lot and his daughters, you remember before this, they had gone to Zoar, but he apparently does not stay there. He leaves and he settles in a cave in the mountains because he was afraid to stay there in Zoar. Now, there's a lot going on here. Why do you think Lot does not stay in this place, Zoar? After all, his request was to go there when he was originally told to go to the mountain. He says, no, let me go here to Zoar. Why does he not stay there now that his request has been granted? Why would he do this? Why would he suddenly leave? Any thoughts?
I suspect they didn't want him.
Okay, I have several reasons. That's partly maybe one. Imagine you're living in Zoar and all the city states around you have been destroyed, and the only people that come out of that are this guy who's not a Canaanite and his two daughters. There could be some victim blaming here. It's like, you must have caused this. You're the only ones who got out. That's certainly possible. Any other thoughts?
Well, you don't hear anything about animals. He was literally alone in his area. So, to, I guess, better his situation, it seemed that he had to leave.
Yeah, we're not told why, and we could guess all day, I suppose. Remember, this was the original instruction was to go to the mountains. Perhaps he thought, well, this city is really not any better. Remember, this is one of the 5 cities that's mentioned with Sodom and Gomorrah way back in chapter 14 as being part of that coalition. Maybe he thinks, well, these people are wicked too. I better get out of here because this place is probably going to be destroyed too. Or maybe he thinks maybe it's better if I just follow the original instruction. It could be that he's afraid, as Jeff mentioned, that people of the city are going to be out after him, blame him for what's happened. I've thought a little bit psychologically about this, and again, I'm going into more than what the text is looking at. But you got to consider, and Arnold's kind of touched on this a little bit. He's kind of lost everything here. Aside from his home, his possessions, his wealth, he's lost his future sons-in-law. Of course, that may not have been much of a loss. He lost his wife, which, however bad she may have been, still his wife. And he's out by himself in a foreign land with his 2 daughters, and that's it. He's had a really rough night. We can say that. He's had a bad night. And I don't know if this could be the case, but there is some studies about people with PTSD who have, really traumatic events that happen to them, that they will self-isolate. It's possible that he just wants to get away from people. It's going to be his coping mechanism. I don't really know. That's certainly a possibility. That's me kind of guessing a little bit more than what the text says. But anyway, for whatever reason, he doesn't stay there. I think that's just an important thing to note there, is he doesn't stay in the place that he requested to go to. So he goes to the mountains, he flees to this cave, and they get out there, and it seems at some point later on, the older daughter of Lot's 2 daughters comes up with this plan to continue their family line and gets the younger daughter to go along with it. Now, this is a terrible plan, but this is what they do. They say their father Lot is old, there's no other men in the area, they're in this isolated place. And so what they decide to do, their fiancés are dead now. What they decide to do is they plan to get their father drunk so they can have sex with him to get pregnant and have children by their father Lot, which sounds really terrible, and it is. Now, one question that is never answered in this is, where does this wine come from? But they had it. I don't know where they got those provisions, but they have this wine. Now, this happens 2 nights in a row. This is not like a one-time thing. This happens 2 times. And Lot apparently got so drunk that he doesn't notice any of this happening. He's just willing to get drunk, doesn't know what's going on at all, has no idea. I think the implication here is it's not something he would have done willingly. If he was sober-minded, he would have not agreed to this. I think maybe though Lot was willing to get drunk, so there's something there about that, is they are pushing him to drink and he seems to do that willingly, which that comes up with other questions. Is he trying to drown his sorrows? It's possible. He's willing to get that drunk that he doesn't know what's going on anymore. And it seems kind of distressing that his daughters are willing to do this to him. For all his faults, I think he is kind of the victim here in this. This is not something he would have agreed to do. This is a scheme they come up with. They don't talk to him about this. It's really kind of a really sad situation. At the end of this year, we're told some kind of historical facts that are important to know. The older daughter has a son named Moab, and the younger daughter has a son named Ben-Ammi. Now, these will be the patriarchs of the Moabites and the Ammonites, respectively. Now, if you go through the Old Testament, you're going to know these nations. These become their own nations. They settle in the lands basically east of where the Israelites will eventually get to in the Promised Land. But these nations are always fighting with the Israelites. There never seems to be, except for very brief moments, much peace between them. Not to say all the Moabites are bad. We do have some in Scripture that we could talk about and say, well, they weren't like this. But by and large, they were wicked nations that constantly had strife with the Israelites, conflict, battles, all these kinds of things. I'm not even going to list all the verses. It's constant. Now, there's one other thing that I think is really interesting and maybe worth talking about is the Moabites and the Ammonites had a very particular idol worship that maybe not totally unique to them, but was credited to them as sort of being the main originators of this. Of course, you have... let's read a section of verses that talk about it. Let's go to 1 Kings chapter 11 real quick. And it'll kind of list it out for me rather than me just saying it. It's always better to let the Scripture say it. I want to read 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 13. And this is in the time of King Solomon in his latter years. It says, King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon had held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of his David his father had been. He followed Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I have commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. All right, I'm going to stop there. You see it mentioned a couple times. It talks about the detestable gods of the Moabites and the Ammonites, Chemosh and Molech. And for those of you who may not be aware, one of their signature things about worship to these gods was offering infant children as sacrifices in the fire to these gods. So a pretty heinous act, all things considered. Of all the idol worship, they were considered some of the worst. Now, these are Lot's daughters who bear the patriarchs of these nations. So it gives kind of an origin for where these nations came from, why they were in that region. So, if we're looking at it historically, now we understand, this is where the Moabites and the Ammonites came from. It came from Lot and his daughter. So it helps kind of wrap that up. Before we close up, and I'll get to final questions at the end, I wanted to do just a quick touch on Lot's family overall, now that we've gone through all these verses, and kind of talk about them a little bit more. Because when you look at Lot's family, they're not mentioned at all until Genesis 19. That's the first time we see that he has a wife and daughters. Now, this would not be uncommon for the Bible to not mention women in the Bible, and even when they're mentioned, they're not mentioned by name. That's kind of par for the course. So one of the things I wanted to think of is, where did they come from? Why are they the way they are? Even though we have so little information about them, what can we kind of suppose or guess about them? Now, again, there's very little information, but there's some things in the surrounding text that might kind of help us get an idea of, well, this is maybe why they're like this. If we look at where Lot leaves Abram, later called Abraham, in Genesis 13, we don't know exactly when this happened. Now, we do know that Abram is 75 years old at the start of Genesis chapter 12, and he's 86 years old at the end of Genesis chapter 16. So it's going to be somewhere in there. My guess is, given from the timeline of events that we see, is probably toward the earlier part of that. So like earlier, middle part of that time span. Genesis 17 through the first part of Genesis chapter 21, they all take place in the same year. I mentioned that earlier today. At the end of Genesis 21, that's when Abraham turns from 99 to 100. That's when Isaac is born. So we get a little bit of a timeline going here. So it's been probably, my best guess, 19 to 23 years of time from Lot's departure from Abram in Genesis 13 to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. So we have a span of about 2 decades here between Lot's departure and then the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, where we see his family mentioned. Now, this would, in theory, give Lot enough time to find a wife, have 2 daughters that are of marrying age, because remember, they were betrothed to be married to 2 men of Sodom. So that time fits. It may not have been they just weren't mentioned. It could have been he didn't have a wife yet. He didn't have daughters yet. It's possible. The reason I think this is interesting is because this explains why Lot's wife turned back a little bit more than just what we see in that one verse. If that's her home, she would have a heart that's more devoted to it than someone who wasn't from there, perhaps. Or you could say, this explains why they're willing to marry their daughters off to men of Sodom when they probably could have found more righteous men somewhere else if they were willing. But there seemed to not be that willingness. This would explain why Lot's daughters were kind of okay with doing this detestable act to their father at the end of chapter 19, because they were kind of around this culture of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is what they were raised with, possibly. This would maybe also explain why we have these detestable idol worships of the Moabites and the Ammonites that are somewhat unique to them, that we don't see anywhere else. That this really detestable idol worship that God over and over and over says, this is the worst. Maybe this came from Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe it was a remnant of that. It's possible, if that's the case. We don't know for sure. But I think that explains a lot of the reasons why Lot's wife isn't, she's turning back, why they're marrying their daughters to men of that city, why the daughters are willing to do this thing, why the idol worship appears in Moab and Ammon later on in the history of those nations, is maybe they were all from Sodom, which in a way makes Lot look a lot worse, because not only did he choose to go there, but then he married someone from there and had a family that wasn't really righteous, at least didn't have the same righteousness as he did, which makes it really kind of even sadder for Lot. He made a lot of really bad decisions. You remember in chapter 13, the reason he divided from Abram is that their flocks were so numerous, so great, the land could not support both of them. That's why they split off into different ways. So he was wealthy, he was rich, he had everything. And then by the time we get to the end of chapter 19 here in Genesis, he's in a cave with nothing, being intoxicated and raped by his daughters, to state it very simply, which is the biggest fall that we ever see of many people. And we don't see anything more of Lot after this. This is the last mention of Lot we're going to see, narratively at least. We'll see him mentioned in reference, but we're not going to see him anymore. Now, we don't know exactly what he did after this. We can't even really guess. The most we know is that his sons, they became the patriarchs of Moab and Ammon, which were hostile nations to the Israelites. So, there's a lot of really sad stuff that comes out of Lot's poor decision to go toward what looked really nice in chapter 13. So that's going to be the end of Lot's story for us. We're going to continue. We're out of time. We're going to continue in chapter 20 next week. Any further comments, questions before we close up this morning? Go ahead, Arnold.
So in a sense, could you say that by the decision Lot's daughters made concerning his seed, which to me now it seemed like it was a pretty bad seed.
Yeah, I can't disagree. I mean, none of this should be happening. Like, this is just all wrong. This whole, aside from maybe the destruction of the cities, getting rid of the wickedness there's nothing good happening here in chapter 19. It's a really sad chapter when you think about it. There's so much wickedness that this is what's going on. And apparently seems to persist even after the destruction, just because of what Lot's daughters decided to do. So, yeah, very sad situation. But like I said, we're not going to see Lot anymore. We're going to move on to chapter 20 next week, focusing more back on Abraham and what his life is going to be. And we're a few chapters away from kind of the end here. So if you have ideas on what we need to do next as far as the class study, start thinking about that, because I think in about a month or so, we're going to be close to the end of talking about Abraham as well. All right. Thank you for your time. We'll continue on next week.